Following World War II, the United States fell deep into the Cold War. In 1945, the Big Three, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, met at a conference in Yalta where empty promises made by the Axis about post-war plans that only made conflicts between the Axis and the Allies. Following the Yalta Conference, Germany was split into four military zones, each belonging to one of the big four powers: France, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. While the Allies promoted a reunited Germany, the Communists only tightened their grip on Eastern Germany. From this point, East and West Germany remained divided for more than 40 years. The Soviet Union then displayed their dominance in Europe by the shutdown Iron Curtain around Eastern Europe, as Winston Churchill said in his Iron Curtain speech. Berlin had been cut off from the Allies when the Soviets attempted to starve the Allies out. Berlin symbolized the Western contact with the East.
And by Christmas, American and British planes had made 100,000 trips and carried a total of 730,000 tons into Berlin.
And when the Allies organized an airlift to the people of Berlin in May 1949, the Soviets lifted their blockade. The concept of containment, coined by George Kennan, emphasized thwarting the spread of communism throughout the world. From this, the Truman Doctrine was derived, hoping to monetarily aid European countries. However, the domino effect took place when China fell to communism. Nuclear warfare perhaps played the largest role in the Cold War. The news that the Soviet Union had run tests of nuclear bombs struck further fear into the American lives. The idea that the Americans were not the only ones with nuclear power was incredible to the American people. Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, began a series of accusations back in the U.S. based off little, if any, evidence. McCarthy falsely accused many people of being part of communist operations. This displayed the true fear of American communists held by the Americans. The technological battle between the U.S. and the Soviets continued with the race to space. The Soviets bested the U.S. when they launched Sputnik, and this proved that the U.S. was not invincible. When it was discovered that the Soviets had missiles stored in Cuba, which was controlled by the communist Fidel Castro, the U.S. and Soviets came face to face when Soviet warships came to the U.S. blockade. Luckily, the conflict was solved and the missiles were removed from Cuba. War was avoided multiple times, and had there been different circumstances, a nuclear holocaust could have resulted in a possible World War III.
The Korean War is often thought of as America's forgotten war. It was not threatening to the U.S. like in World War II, and it did not arouse great controversy like the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union had control of Korea north of the 38th parallel, and the United States had control south of the 30th parallel. In January of 1950, U.S. troops pulled out of South Korea, leaving the citizens vulnerable to an attack from the north. On June 28th, the North Koreans attacked the south with 80,000 troops, capturing the capital city, Seoul. The UN promptly decided to aid South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur was the commander-in-chief of the UN forces. By August 5th, the North Koreans almost made it to the last major city, Pusan. However, they were pushed back by General Walker's 8th Army. MacArthur then landed at Incheon, cutting off supplies to the northern troops. Seoul was then taken by the UN and the communist north was pushed back. The UN then continued to push north past the 38th parallel. As MacArthur's troops steadily continued, China threatened intervention. Once the UN forces got to the border of China, 180,000 Chinese troops attacked. The Chinese took back Seoul, but was stopped just south of the city. While the UN troops were fighting in April of 1951, President Truman fired MacArthur for challenging his authority. He was replaced by General Ridgway. By late June, a battlefront stabilized near the 38th parallel. The war dragged on for 2 more years as peace treaties failed, and the issue of POWs was debated. The war ended on July 27, 1953. 950,000 Chinese and 600,000 North Koreans were killed or wounded, while 300,000 UN troops were killed or wounded in the war. The Korean War was the first part of the Cold War, and it was neither a win nor a loss for the policy of containment.
By the 1950s, civil rights became one of the most controversial and heated issues of the time, while demands for civil rights have reached an all-time high. African Americans were ultimately rewarded in 1954 with the Supreme Court decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which deemed segregation in public schools as unconstitutional. Simultaneously, it overturned the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, which had decreed the establishment of separate but equal facilities. Between 1955 and 1957, many civil rights groups such as the NAACP, SCLC, and the SNCC began to enter the spotlight and increase American awareness about the burning civil rights issues. President Eisenhower did nothing to help the civil rights movement, staying mainly neutral about the issue. During his time in office, he faced the Little Rock integration incident where 9 black students were blocked from entering a high school on the orders of the Arkansas governor. Eisenhower sent federal troops to intervene on behalf of the students and subsequently put the issue to rest. There were many influential civil rights activists during the 50s and 60s, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Stokely Carmichael. John F. Kennedy, however, was a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated before he could pass the civil rights legislation, and the African Americans were forced to wait even longer for liberty. In the summer of 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed by Congress. It eliminated the Southern poll tax designed to make it harder for blacks to vote. By July 2nd of 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, as it prohibited discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, and national origin. In addition, the law provided the federal government with the powers to enforce desegregation. And with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, African Americans were provided with true voting rights. Even with this significant action by the government, conflicts such as riots still occurred. Most famous were the Watt riots, a series of race riots that erupted in a black section of Los Angeles. The last piece of civil rights legislation passed by President Johnson was the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. From this prolific legislation stemmed the equality stated in the Constitution.
The Vietnam War, America's longest war. Vietnam is located in Indochina and known as the country of farmers. During World War II, Vietnam was occupied by the Japanese. With defeat of Japan in 1945, power over Vietnam returned to the French. When the decision of who could be in control of Vietnam was in debate, a man of the name Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist who was considered a communist, was not granted power. Minh fought against the French over control and finally won in 1954. Immediately after the Geneva Conference was assembled and Vietnam was divided over the 17th parallel. After the division of Vietnam, Minh took control of the north and Diem ruled the south. Diem pledged to stop a communist takeover. War broke out between the two sides of Vietnam. America had sided with the South and only sent weapons and advisors so America would not be too involved. In Vietnam, due to Diem's rule, many citizens sided with Minh. These Southerners were known as Viet Cong, and Minh soldiers were the Viet Minh. When American battleships were attacked by North Vietnam, Congress gave President Johnson unlimited military power in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, after which the War of Attrition began. Many Americans were opposed to the war, including college students. On the Vietnamese New Year, the North Vietnamese forces launched a surprise attack termed the Tet Offensive. At this point, the war could not be won if full military were to be used. Later, Americans learned of the My Lai massacre, one of the only known examples of horrid treatment of the natives. When Nixon was put into presidency, he began the process of Vietnamization. This process was handing the war from Americans to South Vietnam. This process also called for the removal of ground troops. The Vietnam War finally came to an end on April 30th, 1975. The southern capital, Saigon, fell to Minh's forces. 56,000 Americans were killed, 300,000 were wounded, and $818 billion were wasted, and this was the first American loss in history.
I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort.
In July 1973, a national nightmare was created when former presidential aide John Dean reported Nixon's involvement in the burglary of the Watergate Hotel and the following attempted cover-up. 5 men were arrested inside the building with electronic bugging equipment in their possessions. They were working for the Republican Committee for the Re-election of the President, known as CREEP. Plans for the break-in were allegedly held on the White House tapes. When the court ordered the White House tapes to be handed over, Nixon attempted to hide behind executive privilege and separation of powers. Furthermore, Vice President Spiro T. Agnew was forced to resign in October 1973. After this event occurred, the Saturday Night Massacre, in which the special prosecutor, attorney, and deputy attorney generals were forced to resign. Eventually, the House Judiciary Committee demanded the Watergate tapes, and although Nixon had cleverly expleted crucial parts of the tapes, he handed over them in full. Before Congress could successfully convict and remove him from office, Nixon smartly chose to resign to maintain retirement benefits and what little honor he had left. At the end, Nixon was still to be tried in court, however. President-elect Gerald Ford pardoned him, casting a shadow of doubt over the Republican Party.